Well, I think we're going to move on to our second panel now, which Miranda Kaufman is going to be chairing. So I'll hand over to Miranda to introduce the speakers. Miranda, you're muted.
Hi, sorry, I was getting drawn into a very interesting discussion in the chat based around the issues around white historians writing Black history. And anyway, so maybe that's something you can discuss in the next the Q&A a bit later on, because obviously there were various interesting issues that came out of that excellent interview, which I really enjoyed. So thank you, Michael, for making that happen. And I've tweeted some more information about the book and links to reviews where you can buy it. I am a massive fan of this book, but I'll stop promoting it now and move on to our Digital Humanities and Databases panel, which is very exciting to hear about, because I think historically, people sometimes say that there's no evidence of Black history, that they can't find it anywhere. And bringing it together on an online database that people can search and see the evidence for themselves can be really powerful. And it also allows us to access history in a different way and in a democratic way where anyone can get into it. You don't have the barriers of university paywalls or anything like that. So I'm really excited about the way that digital humanities is a sort of growth area for history where we can do more and more things with it. But I won't go on about that much more. So we're going to have Charles Foy talking about his Black Mariners database, on which he has written a chapter in the Gretchen's edited collection. And then we're going to have Katie Roscoe talking about taking us to Australia, to Cockatoo Island. And then finally,
presentation.
Sorry? Daniel Dominguez on the Visualizing Abolition project. So, Charles, I can see you're getting ready there. You've shared your screen.
Right.
So, without further ado, I do already have a question for you from Twitter, which is easy to answer, which is this database is the one of the three isn't actually online, is it?
That's correct. Yes.
Will it be at some point?
Next year.
Great. How exciting. Okay.
Okay. So to begin, thanks everyone for coming. Let me just preface my conversation by saying I will be talking about the database. Mostly what I want to do to paraphrase Gretchen, is to tell a different story, is to take British Black mariners' experience and put it within a transnational, transimperial context so that we can understand their choices, most of which were, quite frankly, not necessarily focused on the British Isles. During the 18th century, Great Britain became the predominant power in the Atlantic Basin. It did so through its maritime might. In Denver Brusman's pithy phrase, "No sailors, no navy, no empire," captures well the importance of Britain's maritime sector. As I previously detailed in a series of articles, Black seamen played a critical role in that maritime economy. It's quite frankly, their involvement spanned the Atlantic. They included, slide please, boatmen on West Indies draggers transporting sugar from shore to ship, as you see here. Slide. Africans such as Ben Freeman, who, having served as a royal seaman, carried this tusk as proof of his maritime skills. Can you imagine carrying this around? I was. Next one. African canoemen working for the Royal African Company and British ship captains who brought slaves and supplies to British ships offshore. And then, next one, please. Black sailors on North American merchant ships, which you can't see here, but this labor book literally details several hundred men who worked on a Rhode Island ships for Welcome Arnold. And then last but not least, someone like Thomas Williams, a Black man who sailed out of British ports in the British Isles. The database. My ability to detail the lives of Black mariners is largely through the utilization of the Black Mariner Database, what I call the BMD, which is a data set of more than 41,000 entries for Black seamen or maritime fugitives. Those are men or women who sought freedom via the sea. For each individual, the BMD contains 51 fields of data: age, height, port, place of birth, death, that kind of thing. And given that for most Blacks of the era, most data we have is a simple line and a muster or a baptismal certificate, what this does is enables us to make comparisons across time and locales to determine if an individual Black tar's life was unique or commonplace. So to give you one example, slide please. The BMD permits us to trace cohorts of Black sailors. So here we have a slide that shows us the movement of the HMS Rose in 1776. It came to North America from Portsmouth in 1775 with no whites. And over time, it took on Blacks. This is a reflection of the transformation of being a fugitive to being a seaman. 13 of these men went from being fugitives in Rhode Island to being seamen in the Royal Navy, some of whom had long careers in the Royal Navy and some who became pilots in the Royal Navy. So this is just one example of how the database can be visualized. And also the database, importantly, and demonstrates that Equiano was far from the only British Black mariner who traversed the Atlantic and went across the globe. So let's talk about Black mariners' British identity. I and other scholars such as Vincent Brown have used the BMD to analyze Black seamen's experiences, but largely within the British Isles and the British Empire. This scholarship has emphasized and demonstrated that Black seamen largely in the British Isles, largely not born there and came from elsewhere. And then many Black seamen took their identity through Britishness, in various indicia, whether it's military service, naming practices, or religion. Military service has been important and continues to be important for proving citizenship or subjecthood. So for men who lacked family connections in Great Britain, their skin color who marked them as other, and finding gainful employment difficult, having this indicia of Britishness, i.e. I serve the king, was really important. Next slide, please. So when busking on the streets of London, men like Joe Johnson wearing a headdress that combined Africanness, this wearing a headdress, with the preeminent symbol of Britishness, the HMS Victory, Nelson's ship at Trafalgar, clearly demonstrates and says, I am British. I serve the king in the way that all the other John Bulls did. And so, next slide, he and the other buskers like Billy Waters used their naval service as a way of claiming Britishness and claiming subjecthood. Ultimately, Black Tar's contribution would be recognized in public art, be it in Nelson's column or in artistic depictions such as this one by Maclise of the death of Nelson. You can see the Black man top left. Other Blacks did it through naming. So Timothy Delaware, an ordinary on HM Galley Delaware, or Thomas Arbroath, an able-bodied seaman on the HM Galley Arbroath, and other sailors selected surnames that reflected their naval service. Again, a way of saying I am British. However, British officials viewed these men with suspicion and rarely gave them pensions. And so in such circumstances, it's hardly surprising that British Black seamen would take on and use these emblems, be it putting a headdress on or choosing the name of a former ship, to give them visible indicators to the rest of the world of their service and their Britishness. And finally, British sailors such as Amos Anderson or William Evans or William Williams chose to be baptized as Anglicans in the Church of England, and in doing so demonstrated both a desire for Christian faith, but also their Britishness. Now, the motivations of Black mariners can be hard to tease out because, as I said, data is fairly limited. But there's two things we can know about them. They were deeply concerned about how to obtain freedom and how to fit in whatever society they were in. So knowing this, how can the BMD be used to analyze British Black seamen's lives beyond the British Isles? And how can we use it to employ a wider transatlantic, trans-imperial prism to understand their lives before they got to the British Isles in places like Africa, the West Indies, North America? So first, what I want to do is introduce a concept called what I call the anxious Atlantic. For any Black mariner, free or enslaved, sailing the Atlantic during the 18th century was a perilous endeavor. French, British, Spanish, and American pressing needs for maritime labor, particularly during war, provided employment opportunities for Blacks, but exposed them to the dangers of being enslaved when they went to sea. Often it's only a single sheet of paper was all that stood between them being free and being re-enslaved. This resulted in the anxious Atlantic, where high the level of uncertainty for Blacks when they went to sea. Could they trust captains or shipmates not to attempt to sell them into slavery? Would the crew of an enemy ship seek to sell them into slavery? For black tars, these were not abstract concerns. The risks that Black seamen faced when they fell into 4 discrete categories: prize cases, kidnapping, being returned to their former owners, and treatment under the American Seamen Acts. In each, they faced the loss of permanent freedom. When ships are captured at sea, amnesty law requires the ships and the cargo be brought back to port to be condemned. For much of the 18th century, both British and American courts presumed that all Blacks captured at sea were slaves and put the burden on the Black man to prove otherwise. Thus, in 1776, when the HMS Racehorse, which by the way, Aquiano served on at one point, was captured by the American brig Andrew Doria, the free seaman Patrick Dennis found himself treated as chattel and sold at Philadelphia as a slave. Whites profited by Dennis's misfortune. The crew of the Doria were paid bounties for his capture, while Dennis's Philadelphia purchaser turned around and put him back to sea, profiting from his maritime experience. The whites' profit motive also resulted in kidnapping of Black sailors throughout the empire, both in England and in the Americas. The BMD contains 75 entries of which Black tars such as Henry Monroe, a free Bristol seaman, were forcibly carried away and sold into slavery. It's the rare instance, unfortunately, in which government officials interceded to assist these Black tars. The Royal Navy itself was also involved in the re-enslavement of Black sailors. In 1758, when the HMS Jason was at Portsmouth, a Maryland slave owner, who knows how he was able to do this, was able to find his former slave, William Stevens, in Portsmouth, serving on the Jason. Came to the captain of the Jason, said, "He's my guy." Without question, the Admiralty directed the captain of the Jason to turn the man back over. He was unceremoniously returned to his owner and enslavement in England. This is hardly an isolated incident, as the Royal Navy returned Black seamen to their former owners, not only in England, but in North America and the West Indies. And then lastly, although the American Seamen's Acts do not directly require the enslavement of Black tars, free Black tars, its enforcement provisions did result in that. So when Black seamen from Britain came to southern ports like South Carolina, Charleston, or Savannah, they were required to be confined in jail for the time the ship was in port. If their jail fees were not paid, they could and were sold into slavery. So we have a situation where prize cases, kidnappings, threats of being returned to slavery, all for merely doing their job, resulted in constant threats to British Black seamen's lives throughout the Atlantic. It was in this fraught environment in which Black seamen and maritime fugitives need to have considered where they want to live their lives, whether in the British Isles or elsewhere. So let's talk about the elsewhere. Where else might they decide to have gone? Or what I would refer to as trans-imperial movement. First off, lacking large sizable population of whites in the French and Spanish Caribbean, privateers of those nations regularly employed considerable numbers of Black seamen. They did so to basically combat British maritime power. In addition, the naval ships of those two nations also employed large numbers of Blacks. And let me just give you one example. When we do a random sampling of musters of French naval ships captured by the British Navy, 54 of those ships captured French vessels between 1745 and 1800. Of the 125 ships they captured, there were 1,343 Black sailors on those French naval ships. By the way, French historians don't talk about this at all. An average of 11 Blacks per ship, not a small cohort. The lack of white seamen in French and Spanish West Indies created opportunities for Blacks, both fugitives and free seamen. The result is there's a movement of Black seamen and Black futures across what I call zones of transition. What are zones of transition? Zones of transitions are where geography, war, maritime labor needs, and political considerations all combine to make the line between freedom and unfreedom very porous. So to give some examples, the strait between Jamaica and Cuba, the waters between New York and Philadelphia during the American Revolution, and Chesapeake Bay in 1777. Slide. As this slide shows, you have fugitives fleeing from Maryland at the top, that's the number 13, and from Virginia, that's the number 140, two British naval ships in 1777 when the British Navy is moving north to invade Philadelphia. This shows a transformation, in fact, in the environment of Chesapeake from maritime flight, which was mostly by canoes and small vessels across the bay prior to the British Navy showing up, to where Blacks fled or came onto the Royal Navy and were then transported to freedom, either in Philadelphia or later to New York. And so there's this process that happens, what I call doors open, doors closed. The door was largely closed before Howe showed up with all the ships. He shows up with the ships and literally 153 men jump on his boats and sail away, okay? So it's one of these things where we have a patchwork. For the purpose of the paper, what I want to do is focus on one zone of transition, that between South Carolina and Florida in the first half of the 18th century. And in doing so, what I want to stress first and foremost is these zones of transition are all different. Depends upon time, place, and political considerations. But they all share the dynamic that they open up a porous boundary that Blacks can exploit. In the first half of the 18th century, enslaved individuals regularly fled from South Carolina to Spanish St. Augustine. The BMD contains almost 300 examples of such runaways, and they fall into three categories. Many, such as boatswain, were fishermen or boatmen in the Carolinas who used their maritime experience to head south in boats or other small vessels. Other escapees include, slide please, newly imported African-born men, such as this oarsman, who, by the way, this drawing is on the back of a plantation receipt. There's no archive entry for this. You would never know this unless you turned it over. And what the receipt was talking about hiring oarsmen to move rice down the Wando River 100 miles to Charleston. So clearly, the rice planter was concerned and interested in these men and their ability to give him profit. We don't know if this man running away, but many men like him who had experience as oarsmen literally paddled from South Carolina to Florida. And how do we know that? Well, newspaper accounts talk about, quote, 10 or 12 Blacks in stolen canoes, quote, end quote, arriving weekly in the Spanish port. And the third group of South Carolinians were experienced seamen, Black experienced seamen, who made their way to St. Augustine. So an example was Captain Caleb Davis, who in 1738 docked at St. Augustine with a cargo of rice and was attempting to try to locate seamen of his who had ran away from a prior voyage. When he recognized several of his fugitive seamen, he called out to them, "Hey, come back." And they all laughed. Why? Because St. Augustine protected them. They knew they were free. Why was freedom available in St. Augustine? Because St. Augustine needed the maritime skills of these men and needed their labor for military purposes to fight the British. So what kind of life did these men find in St. Augustine that they rejected not only leaving South Carolina, but not going to another place in the British Empire, including England, which there are examples of fugitives leaving Carolina for England. What's the life they found in St. Augustine? Well, Spanish policy offered freedom to any fugitive coming from the Carolinas if they did two things. They served in the military and they converted to Catholicism. Now, military service would have been a pretty reasonable choice for these men because it's far less strenuous than the service and the work in rice plantations in Carolina. However, Catholicism might be a difficult task. For some people, it was a bridge too far. You had the groups of people who might not want to give up their African spiritual beliefs. And you also had a group of enslaved people in the Carolinas who came from Angola, who had Catholic backgrounds, they would like you to go to St. Augustine, but if you were inoculated to the British dislike or distaste or hatred of Catholicism while living in Carolina, you might not see this as a relatively positive option. However, given the large numbers of slaves who fled to St. Augustine, it appears that this issue of conversion wasn't problematic for most South Carolinian slaves. St. Augustine also had something else that the British colonies did not, and England did not. It attracted a large number of Blacks because there was already a sizable free Black community in the area. By fleeing there or moving there, Black seamen found a life of stability in which their maritime skills were paid, basically recognized, and they could establish family lives. Many of the men moving there married, had families, had their children baptized in the Catholic religion, and established a network of kinship relations that most Blacks moving to the British Isles never were able to do, in large part because of demographic imbalance between who fled to the UK and who didn't, i.e. very few Black women fled to the United Kingdom. So St. Augustine, despite the fact that it's Spanish, it's Catholic, it's an enemy of the British, had real appeal for these Black seamen. In addition, Spain's reliance upon these men's military labor and maritime skills ensured stability, ensured long-term employment, ensured that they would have economic independence. Many of the Blacks who fled and landed up in the British Isles, who were seamen, especially during the American War of Independence, became Black poor and ultimately chose to leave England for Sierra Leone because conditions were not good for them. That's not true in Spanish Florida. In Spanish Florida, some of these men became captains of Spanish ships, were treated with respect. This circumstance of a place of refuge in St. Augustine lasted until 1763. And this is where the door closes. The door closes when, at the end of the 7 Years' War, Great Britain takes over East Florida. Okay? And in conclusion, what I want to say is this. For British Black mariners, the Black Mariner database clearly shows that the Atlantic was a patchwork. It was a quilt of both opportunity and also possible re-enslavement. Doors that opened at one period of time that offered freedom and a life of economic independence, such as between Jamaica and Cuba. There are large numbers of slaves who flee away from Jamaica to the South Shore of Cuba. There's large numbers of slaves who go to Cuba. Prior to 1792, but in 1792, Great Britain and Spain reach a treaty. The cedulas allowing freedom for Black runaways in Cuba ends, and that door is closed. And so who's successful in this trans-imperial movement? It's people who know, Blacks who know, Black seamen who know about bureaucratic and legal requirements and also are adaptable, who are willing to change and modify who they are and how they think about themselves, Protestant to Catholic, English, British to Spanish, as a way of reestablishing life or creating a new life of freedom and economic independence. Thank you.
Very good, very good. Okay.
Great, thank you so much, Charles, and very good timekeeping as well. So thank you for that.
Thanks.
So when is the database going to be available next year?
Right now, I'm really going through the 41,000. So to give you some sense of the content, there are 5 million fields of entry that I have to go through. I'm at this point, I'm 62% have gone through it because there's a double check. One of the things I'm finding out is there are double entries because, let's say, John Henry, I found him as a slave and a muster, but he then shows up in a trial record, and the graduate student will enter them as both. I go through it and say no. So I'm going through that. I would suspect probably midsummer till fall next year.
Brilliant. I can't wait. And is it right that there was About 1,700 were British.
Well, no, the 1,700 is in the Royal Navy. So,
Right. Okay. I thought.
And actually, that number is. I just looked at the numbers this morning. It's actually over 2,000 now that I've got in the Royal Navy, who are seamen. There's also 2,500 French prisoners of war who are Black. There's also another almost 600 refugees, maritime fugitives on Royal Navy ships. So there's a whole group. There's a large number of Blacks moving onto these ships who are different categories. Sometimes you come onto the ship and you are enslaved and you're a refugee, and then you choose to take the King's shilling and become a seaman. Mm-hmm. And so status changes. And so I would say, if I was to use round numbers, it's more like 2,000 in the Royal Navy. Total British seamen is probably closer to 5,000 to 8,000. It's a larger number.
Great. I've got to update my tweets now. That's great. That's really helpful. And actually, we had a presentation on the prisoners of war at Portchester Castle at a previous event a couple of years ago. So it would be interesting to connect you with those people, because you probably have new information that they could use to present there in the future.
Right. And one of the things I've just done, I've got an article coming out in the French publication Lumineers in the spring on French Black mariners, who I largely know about because they're captured by the English. And so they had the reverse trans-imperial movement. Some of them actually choose to stay in England. They marry English women. So this part of what I'm trying to do in this project is get people to think not in national silos, because these men obviously are moving around the Atlantic, and they change their identity based upon tactical reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what. Yeah, one of the things. I've started interviewing Charles instead of timekeeping and moving on to the next presentation, but I'm sure we can go into this in the Q&A. But yeah, it's definitely. I mean, I think when we're looking at Black history in general, making national distinctions can be a bit limiting in some ways, because it is such a global history. So that's a really interesting illustration of that. And one day I'll talk to you about Black Tudor mariners and how they were all doing similar things in different contexts. Anyway, moving on, it'd be great to hear from Katie now and taking us to Australia.
Hi, everybody. Just going to share my screen. Could you let me know that you can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can see you.
All right.
You can see your screen. There we are. It looks great.
Okay. Brilliant. I'll get started then. I just wanted to start off by thanking the organisers. It's really great to be able to join, even if it is virtually. I will just, so today I'm talking about Black convict lives on Cockatoo Island, and I am coming to this as a historian of punishment and empire. So I'd really welcome feedback on aspects that I may have just from a specialist audience. I know many of you are experts. And I'm going to basically be talking about a project that I completed as part of an Economic and Social Research Council project I did last year, which involved creating a database that felt big, but now I hear Charles's, I realise it was pretty minor really. It was around 2,500 prisoners who were incarcerated on Cockatoo Island, which is a colonial prison island, a bit like Alcatraz, but in Sydney Harbour. So in the sort of main part of the talk, I'm going to describe the lives of 5 different Black convicts. They were either Afro-Caribbean, African-American, or Black British or Black Irish. And then in the second half, I'm going to sort of discuss the challenges and opportunities for sort of putting these resources online, and how people from particularly Australia engaged with this kind of resource, and whether it can be decolonized, and how I try to go about doing that. If you are someone who likes to be on Twitter, my Twitter handle is here. Feel free to tag me in anything or share slides. So a little bit about Cockatoo Island. Wariyama is the largest island in Sydney Harbour. It's located where the Parramatta River meets the Tasman Sea. It is Wangal country. It was probably used prior to invasion as a fishing and boat building spot. At the time, it was covered in red gums, which attracted the birds that gave it its European name, but it changed radically when it became a prison in 1839. The convicts were set to work deforesting the island, and then using explosives to blast the cliffs to have sandstone for a large building project, which the largest public works that they worked on was a dry dock. So work began in earnest in 1847, and this labour was really meant to be sort of the crux of punishment. So they chose a very labour-intensive way of building it, armed mostly with pickaxes. The prisoners carved a sort of chasm into the foundation of the island, which was the dry dock, and it had a thick shale layer underneath. So it took them more than 10 years. And as a result, they were overtaken in their desire to build the largest dry dock in the Southern Hemisphere for Royal Naval ships. And nonetheless, it opened in 1857. And I suppose the most remarkable aspect is that the island operated as both a prison and a dockyard for more than a decade. Convicts manned the workshops, built the workshops, and also extended the dry dock in order to incorporate steam vessels, because technology had overtaken events by this point. In 1869, it closes as a prison, partly because it's very difficult to maintain discipline while you've got sailors and docks. And it was sort of handed over to the Royal Navy from there. So Cockatoo Island has got quite an iconic status, I'd say, in the history of Sydney. Some of you may have even visited if you've ever been. But basically, that's got to do in large part with it's extremely visible. It's right in the middle of the harbour. It's a great view if you want to see the fireworks from there in New Year's. But it's also got a sort of iconic status in terms of the state's convict history. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site because of its history as a convict labour stockade. And it's associated with convictism because it was established as a secondary punishment station. So it's essentially for convicts who had misconducted or broken the terms of their freedom, which was known as a ticket of leave, effectively a parole. They would then be punished here. And that's because it was considered extra cruel to punish people on this secure island, but right in the view of society, effectively. Over the next few decades, there were less and less convicts because convict transportation to New South Wales actually ceased in 1840 for the most part. But it still held sort of people from colonial society, as in people who'd been just convicted for the first time in the colony, but they were still considered the worst of the worst. It had the reputation of holding the dregs of colonial society, as one newspaper put it in the 1860s. So as a result, the stories I'm going to tell you today, they're divided between either transported convicts or free migrants who were then convicted in the colony. As I'm sure you're aware, Australia was a penal colony founded by convicts, but it was also founded on whiteness. Previously, convict transportation had been to places that had an existing industry, so to the American colonies. Convict labour was meant to compete with enslaved and indentured labour. But as Hamish Maxwell Stewart has argued, in the late 18th century, the British state really wants to harden these racial hierarchies, keep whites separate. And as a result, they decide to experiment by sending white convicts to a remote island continent and have them dispossess Indigenous people through farming and settlement. They themselves were seen as unable to exercise property rights because they were hunter-gatherers under stadial theory and scientific racism. And Cassandra Pybus and Ian Duffield have shown that, notwithstanding this being the fact that most of the convicts were transported were white, there were a small but significant proportion of black convicts, many transported from the metropole, from places like London, which was overrepresented in terms of people transported, and also some of them as part of intercolonial circuits of crime. And one such man who ended up on Cockatoo Island was Benjamin Fraser. He was born in 1817, and as a boy, he worked as on a plantation in Grenada. So he was listed as a field labourer, indoor servant, and cook in his prison register. From the name, I wondered if he might possibly have been enslaved to the Scotsman Alexander Fraser, potentially on the Lavara estate, but that's something that I need to continue to do research on. But nonetheless, he was transported for stealing money and sentenced to 7 years at the Grenada Supreme Court in 1835, aged just 18. He has He is listed in his register that he has a scar across his left cheekbone, very possibly a mark of punishment. He also is listed, and I think this is quite evocative, as having a gap between his middle front teeth, so we get a small sense of what he might have looked like. Unfortunately, he passed from one coercive regime into another and is kind of basically continually circulating through the carceral system within Australia. He doesn't get to live free. He's continuously under punishment. 1 year later, he's sentenced to 12 months in an iron gang, which would have been building roads in chains. He's then, in 1837, in custody at Parramatta Jail. And in 1838, he's sent to the most notorious hell on earth, a remote Pacific island called Norfolk Island, after being convicted of breaking and entering. And I've got two images here, which just showed, I think, how similar some of the motivating colonial logics are here. The top image is an image of a plantation in Grenada, and the bottom is Norfolk Island. And in both, you can see how absent coercive labour is, and yet we see these kind of pristine, very much worked colonial landscape that's presented as the ideal. He disappears from the sort of convict system for a while, which hopefully means that he was succeeding. We do know that in that time period, he seems to have retrained as a harness maker, because that is listed as his occupation when he's reconvicted again in 1852, again for housebreaking. He ends up on Cockatoo Island just for a year before being released to a ticket of leave to Maitland. But there, just 6 months later, he's convicted again, this time for stealing a watch, and is back on Cockatoo Island before being discharged in 1854, where I lose track of him. John Perry was another convict who was transported, though this time under the exile scheme, which is slightly different. He was born in Dublin in 1819. His father was in the military in the 32nd Regiment as a drummer, known by the not very innovative moniker Black Charlie. As a result, Perry was sort of exposed to a lot of militaristic, masculine kind of activity, and ends up training as a boxer formerly in Liverpool as an adult. He's a very imposing figure. He's more than 6 feet tall. When he's buying a suit for his wedding, he hands over a forged note and is basically arrested on the spot. His register states that he cannot read or write, but yet I wonder if his imposing physique and his blackness didn't endear him to the white jury, because they sentenced him to 7 years transportation, and he was sent aboard the Eden to Port Phillip. Under this scheme, the exile scheme, he would have spent 9 months in a penitentiary before leaving. But when he arrived in Australia, he would immediately be free. So just 1 year later, he is living free and he becomes a prize fighting champion of New South Wales, which we can see an image of here in the paper, after defeating George Howe. In the meantime, it seems likely he worked as a dockyard labourer. His occupation is listed as a shipwright, and he's got a cutlass scar to prove it, and a tattoo of an anchor, as well as an S for his late wife, Sarah. But a few years later, he falls on hard times, and he ends up being tried at the Brisbane Circuit Court for larceny, and receives a long sentence for larceny, 6 years, which is then commuted to 5. Perhaps he was known in the area. It's unclear why it's so disproportionately long. He's aged 32 by this point. And while on the island, the rather corrupt Irish superintendent Charles Ormsby spots a chance to make some money and have some entertainment. He complains a lot about being isolated on the island away from society. And he starts basically a prisoner boxing ring, which all the guards and even eventually soldiers come to the island explicitly to watch and bet on this. So this is an open secret for a while in colonial society, and John Perry keeps coming back to Cockatoo Island, another stint in 1855 and 1856, where he continues to be kind of famed as Black Perry the boxer, until there's an inquiry in 1857 that closes it down. And in kind of characteristic colonial style, they're not concerned about the safety of the prisoners or indeed the ethics, but more that the strong physique of someone like Perry was being wasted on boxing when he would be excellent at quarrying, but he was being kept away from that by the governor who assigned him, the superintendent who assigned him as a warder, so that he would always have an excuse to be in the prison and therefore could be boxing. Of the other sort of group of convicts that were on Cockatoo Island were technically colonial prisoners. So they were convicted after arriving in Sydney, either sort of in passing on shore leave as sailors and then committing some kind of crime, or having migrated there as free men. And it's the island then in a way sort of is a bit of a microcosm for these changing imperial circuits that were initially everyone was arriving to Australia was through convict transportation, and then we see different kinds of migration and different sort of forms of coercion taking place. Usually these crimes are fairly minor for the mariners. So a pretty typical example is William Finch, who's a barber from St. Thomas. He arrived aboard a merchant ship called the S.H. Talbot from New York, and he's listed as an occupation as cook, so he was the ship's cook. He's described as having a lot of scars along his arms. And basically, he is drinking at this watering hole, the Crown and Kettle Inn on Hope Street, along with a steward of the Monarch who offers him a place to stay that night. And overnight, he steals a watch and chain from him after some heavy drinking. He tries to pawn it the next day, is caught and sentenced to 3 years hard labour at Sydney Court of Sessions, aged 21. While he's there, he's pretty well behaved. He does a bit of gambling, a bit of fighting, but he's discharged just 2 years later to Yaz. And I suppose the irony here is that while on the island, his skills or his knowledge of the dockyard and the ship's workings would have presumably been quite useful, but because it was functioning as a dockyard by this point. But when he went to Yaz, which was an extremely rural area, he would most likely have struggled to necessarily find anything using that particular skill set. William Barry is a similar kind of case, another ship's cook, this time coming from New York aboard the steamer, the J.R. Morris, who was also convicted of theft. This one was a little bit more ostentatious. On one evening, on the 29th of June, 1858, he basically goes on a spree. He goes to the sailors' boarding house on George Street, and from there to 3 different ships are docked at the Circular Quay, and just steals anything that's unattended, including several watches, a coat, sailors' discharge wages, and various seals of approval to get more goods. And I think it's interesting to think about how in this, he was using both his knowledge of these systems of payment and this social context, but also this was probably one of the few places in the city where his blackness would go unremarked upon, and he could be an anonymous kind of figure here, because it's the most multicultural sort of streets in the city. He's sentenced to 5 years hard labour on the roads. Again, potentially his knowledge of ship's workings may have been useful here. He may well have traded tobacco with the sailors on the island. A lot of the prisoners did trade tobacco informally and illicitly with the sailors who were out off the ships, throwing them off in shoes and all kinds of things. He manages to get early release by petitioning on behalf of his impoverished family left back in New York, and they allow him to leave aboard the Oakland to go back to America on the condition of leaving the British dominions, which is quite common for those people that came from outside the British colonies. And the final person I want to talk about is a different case altogether. He is called Lewis Dawson Clark Sims, and he is a barber from New York. He is a bit of an elusive figure. He arrived in 1838, possibly via the Orantes ship, possibly in 1836. But somehow he ends up becoming a bushranger, which is an Australian highwayman. They worked on the frontier of the bush. They tended to work as part of a gang in organised gangs to steal livestock. But the mythology around bushranging is certainly extremely white and extremely foundational to Australia's national identity. The idea is it started off as kind of a notoriety and a fear, and then by the 20th century it morphed into a kind of another example of the mastery of the white man over the bush and a kind of working class daring do. So this picture from a cigarette packet kind of gives you the typical example. But work by people like Meg Foster has really been challenging this. And ironically, the very first bushranger recorded in Australia was, in fact, of African descent. Black Caesar, as he was known, had been transported in the first fleet from Madagascar for stealing. And so in some ways, Black Sims was exactly in his model, but we're talking 60 years later, just another example of how the history is never as white as it first, the myths like to create. The problem is, though, the myths are more potent for Lewis Sims than what I can find actually about the man. So a lot of the time his blackness ends up being kind of conflated as both race and villainy. And he seems to be involved in this organized livestock gang. But when one of his gang, Scannell, decides to basically inform on him, he is repeatedly described as a hero, as we'd usually see with bushrangers. He's a hero for attempting to stop him. He supposedly chases him across the bush to try and bring Black Sims to justice, the notorious cattle thief. In fact, he's actually just been arrested for a rape conviction, which leaves his wife and his child without any sustenance or help, and they end up perishing as a result. Meanwhile, Lewis Sims is also picked up, but on the charge of stealing one grey mare in 1859, and he's sentenced to 10 years, which is far above the average. The average for something like that would be 6 years on Cockatoo Island. So this could reflect a notoriety. And then he is on the prison for, he's in Cockatoo Island, on Cockatoo Island for just a few years before he receives a conditional pardon and seems to disappear. So if he's such a prolific bushranger, it seems strange that he doesn't have a long list of convictions like most of the bushrangers on Cockatoo Island do have. It's possible that this mythology completely is based pretty much on his race. So this, very quickly, because I can see I'm running out of time, this is kind of the record that I started off with. And it's pretty typical for a convict register. And this is what I ended up with, an Excel spreadsheet, which you can download from my website. The URL is here. But I suppose the most important thing to mention is that really, you know, when I was reading through it, and there was, you know, loads and loads of Williams and Johns, all from different parts of England, pretty much. I was really interested every time I came across someone that was a bit different. There was a person of colour or came from a different, outside of the British Empire or a different part of the world. But the vast majority were Europeans from Britain, Ireland. And I wanted to sort of showcase these different cases through the Convict Lives blogs and showcase the diversity. But when I looked at the viewing figures, I discovered that most people went directly to the database and to find their own particular convict ancestor. And so were far less likely to actually engage with any of these stories. And so that's really made me think about how I succeeded neither really in diversifying or decolonizing convict history. And part of the issue, our issue is that narrative is extremely steeped in whiteness, that is a foundational part of the Australian national mythology, and that we really need to continue to recognize and popularize the foundational role of Afro-Caribbean and Black British, Black Irish people in both Australians' convict society and the colonial society that grew up from there. And that the digital arena is really where this needs to be done, because this is the main site that people engage with this history. And that this arena needs to be decolonized to embed the analysis of power structures, entanglements between enslavement, convict transportation, indigenous dispossession, and global capital that are all involved in this process. And it's worth saying here that, you know, the indigenous prisoners who were also sent to Cockatoo Island, many of them after conviction for basically resisting invasion, were also described in very similar ways as Black, or informally as, quote, darkies. So there's definitely a relationship here between dispossession and then the kinds of people that are caught up in these coercive imperial circuits, all as part of this colonial system. And yeah, I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to kind of conclude with the fact that I recognize these are not the full lives that I would like to be able to tell. These are very fragmentary accounts. I'm hoping to add to them, but the reality is what survives in the archive is shaped by all kinds of factors, and that includes whether you're a convict or you're a migrant, whether you're what race you are, what nationality you are, and of course, the more recidivist you are, the more easy you are to find. And so some of the people that disappear may well have been the more successful ones. And yeah, I chose this image because this is the most famous image of Cockatoo Island prisoners. And I just think it's very interestingly racially ambiguous, though I'm sure I don't think it was necessarily intended to be. It probably was just showing suntanned laborers, which was a sign of kind of convictism. But yeah, it's the only sort of image that we have of Cockatoo Islanders. And I think they could kind of be anyone from that image. So I'll leave it there, and there's a URL to the website for those that are interested.
Great, thank you so much, Katie. It's good to be, you know, taken beyond the Atlantic world, because I think we quite often limit ourselves to that ocean. So again, brilliantly global stories. And I think a lot of common threads that we can explore in the Q&A, and there's some good questions coming through in the chat. Hopefully some of our art historians will have some thoughts on that sketch. Finally, I haven't had to interrupt at all. I'm very grateful for that. Thank you very much. Good timekeeping is a virtue, which I lack personally, so I'm very impressed. There's a few questions that have come through in the chat. I'm just trying to keep on top of them. I think you've answered some of them in the chat. So I think there's a few things that I suppose there are a few things here, some related to the history and some related more to the technicalities of creating a database and stuff. So the first question in the chat was from Sophie Merricks, who is actually just embarking on her own database project, which she might want to tell you about. But so her question, which I think might apply to all of you, be interesting to hear what you have to say about it, is which records did you look at when compiling your data? How did you find them, and how did you go about identifying the people as Black? How did you establish that what their ethnicity was from the records? What kind of language are we talking about? Should we start with Charles? Go in order of presentation. You're on mute. Sorry, that's okay.
Sorry,
There we are.
my apology. The problem with my database is it's not a static database. It has a wide variety of different documents. So the problem, and the question I was going to raise for Katie, because it seems that she may have a similar issue, is on category of the field where it says race. What I do is, and it may sound very either old-fashioned or awkward, I just either put Negro, white, or unknown, and then next, so let's say it says Negro, I then put in parentheses next to it how the term used by the actual document. So sometimes it'll say Black, sometimes it'll say color, sometimes I'm going to say Mestizo, whatever, because the documents are from a wide variety of places and times, and also created for different purposes. So by trying to sort of like flatten the racial categories to just 3, and then give the subcategory, give the actual language, people then can themselves go into that racial field and pull out and play with it as ever they want. To some degree, I mean, this goes to Katie's issue about what do these archives do. I realize this, I'm reinforcing a binary Black-white world to some degree, but it's easier in terms of actually trying to do that when you have multiplicities of different documents, and then by doing a subcategory will give people the ability to manage, and use the data in the way that they need to, and reflect the actual document. But it's extremely hard, because once you get past just using one category of documents, then you get into this issue of I say brown, you say Black. Who is this person? Especially when it's a different, it's over a 100-year period of time. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the problem I have.
Did you come across individuals where it was actually, you weren't sure what their origin was and you didn't know whether to put them in or not?
Yeah, and so the one benefit, or part of the reason why my database is taking so long to do, is I have a field that's called text. I have in that field every word I have about the guy on the original document. So, one of the issues, for example, you go to Translated Slave Database, it's a wonderful tool, but it tells you, it gives you the data as they've interpreted it. It doesn't give you the actual muster or, colonial officer's document. I've actually embedded that. I've typed it in to the document. So then somebody could also do their own search. They could go to the text field and do their own search based upon whatever terms they want to, and they could come up with their own way of reusing the data. I mean, I think to some degree this goes to Katie's issue about how these archives are created, and what they do is, can we create ways in which people can manipulate them and use the data for their purposes, not our purpose? So I mean, it's a long answer to a short question.
No, that's great. I very much appreciate the full text because it's very useful. That sounds brilliant. Sorry, which database were you comparing it with, where they interpreted it themselves?
Well, Transatlantic Site Database, when you do,
Right.
it doesn't give you the full text. It gives you, they're very good about the citations, but sitting in New York, I don't have access, especially now in pandemic world, to get to Q and go look at that original document and compare. So that, I think that, what, Daniel has done, and Katie both done by putting the original documents on, it gives you the researcher ability to manipulate yourself. And I think that's one of the problems, because we all have our own biases and our own, sort of ways of thinking about the world. And, Michael asked the question to Gretchen in the interview, the difference between American and British Black history. There's real differences in how people look at things. And so I think that's part of the problem with these databases is, how much do we reflect us and how much can people then access and use it for their own purposes?
Mm. And did you choose to use the word Negro because it was one that came up in the sources a lot, or?
You use the word Negro because basically it's based on the racial category Negroid, but also it's in my time period, 18th century, that's the primary racial category from which there's all these other things, Mezito, mulatto, whatever. And so it seemed to me to be the easiest way to allow people to enter into that, knowing full well that there's a complexity behind that. One of the things I'm going to hopefully do, and I don't know if Daniel and Katie have done this, I'm going to I have a guide and they basically post on saying, here's the assumptions I've made, here's how I've done it. So that, for the nerds, who are really interested, they can actually look back and figure out what the decision-making was, and in their own way, how they can unpack it and redo it themselves.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. So Katie, what about you on this?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with a lot of what Charles has said. And so for my data set, was quite lucky about convict sources is they go into quite a lot of detail about physicality because they're worried about escaping, right? They want to identify them. So in that sense, the complexion is usually listed as Black. And then within that, they're not always, but they also list a place that they're from. So then usually, so if it's Black for an Aboriginal person, rather than ship, they'll put Aboriginal. So then you can always usually tell that who it is. But I suppose, and then if it's somebody that say Southeast Asian, it will say copper for complexion. So it is these kinds of historic terms, but it is quite useful, as Charles is saying, to identify people that are from elsewhere, particularly because I don't know, at least for the African American or Black British prisoners, they have they correctly describe their names or something, whereas actually it's much harder if you're looking for an Indigenous prisoner. They tend to really change their names a lot, as in how it's said, and they get so it can be really like every single time you record it, so it's much harder to be sure it's the same person. So I've just kept the terms as described in a similar way to Charles. I didn't want to add too many layers of interpretation, but I do think I want to develop the web resource to maybe actually have a page that discusses a little bit more why these terms and what that reflects, because it is this quite clear divide in their mind. And sorry, I think that answers the question. So I really did just stick with what they said originally. And
when your sources, there's a very clear distinction between Aboriginal people and Black people from outside Australia originally.
Within the sort of, so they'll say A, they'll list them as a place being born in Australia, but B, they'll literally say Aboriginal separately in a way that they don't bother with with Chinese, and they'll say it for Chinese people as well, and they won't bother to list the ship that they've arrived on. They'll just list their race. Whereas for everybody else, if they're from anywhere else in the world, they'll list the ship that they arrived on, which is frustrating if you're trying to find a Chinese indentured person, because then you just have no idea where they came from, if they're even actually Chinese or from somewhere else in East Asia.
Yeah, so I'm completely ignorant. Like, so what sort of was the rough numbers of Black people in Australia who weren't Aborigines?
I put that together for my thesis, so I'll have to check the total number because I don't think anybody's fully put it together. Okay. I will check that and put it in the chat because I don't want to just speculate.
All right, great. Well, tweet about it later. Okay, fantastic. And Daniel, what are your thoughts on sort of terminology and how we identify people?
Yes, that's a very difficult question or issue to deal with. So my visualizing abolition is really more about correspondence. It's a database of correspondences, and the overwhelming majority of the people who appear as senders or receivers are white people, mainly British officers. Right? So in this particular project, I didn't come across that challenge, but I participate in other projects where that's a thorny issue. And some of the solutions that we come up with was creating a page for essays, right? A guide that we have on our website. Visualize Abolition has a page on essays. I didn't mention here in my presentation, but it has a page on essays that talks about different aspects of the history that the website tells, and also about the development of the website. So that's helpful. One problem with all of that is that attitudes, right, change over time. So, for example, I was fascinated by watching the presentations here and people referring to the enslaved as slaves. Here on this side of the pond, on the western side, now there's been a move to avoid using the term slave and prefer enslaved, right? So, so that means that we would have to go back to our websites and update all that terminology. So it is a challenge, and I don't think at this point that any of us really found an optimal way of dealing with that issue. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I actually copy pasted the description of your database into my preview of the event today, and then had to go back and change it and change slave to enslaved because anyway. So it's tricky. But I think there needs to be an ongoing discussion about language, and we're pretty good at coming up with new language as a human race. So we should keep trying. Okay. Right. So Katie's added in the chat around 1,000 Black convicts in Australia, but the colonial prisoners arrived free but convicted in Australian colony would not be included, based on Ian Duffield's work. Right, and that's out of a total of 160,000 convicts. So a small but very interesting to learn about minority. Brilliant. So I'm sort of trying to. I think some of the other questions have been answered.
If I may,
do any of the speakers have a particular question they've noticed or that they wanted to comment on?
Well, if I may add just one more point, maybe to help Charles and Katie. For example, in the Voyages project, we have two sets of columns, right? One set referring to data variables, so that is to say variables or columns that show the data as they appear in the records, and a set for what we call imputed variables, right? And in the imputed, that's where we put what we think the information in the data column are referring to. So that's another way of addressing that in the databases specifically.
Right.
So I had sorry, go on, Charles.
I was going to follow up on that your comment in the chat about using ethnic identity. I have that also, although again, it's one of these mismatches because of the nature of information. So in a Royal Navy muster, they'll not mention ethnicity, but in a certificate of protection issued by the American authorities, they might, and in future slave ads, they will, depending upon where they're issued. So, it's one of these things where it can be helpful. Again, I think it's one of these things that, Daniel's comment about imputed versus, stated is helpful. But I also think it's one of these things where, to be frank, The casual or genealogical users of these data sets will not do that kind of deep digging. It's the academics who have to do the deep digging and re-manipulate the information, I think, ultimately. I think this, what I'm really saying, I think this only, you only can take it so far, and then the viewer's got to, the user of the information's got to decide for themselves what is the critical ways of then taking that data and breaking it apart for their purposes.
And that brings up that fascinating situation where you end up with several records referring to the same person, but in one record it might mention that they're African, and then in another one it might not mention that at all. And that's something I know that Kathy Chater came across. She's been talking in the chat as well, when she's looking at Africans in the long 18th century in Britain. You really, you've got to, there's a lot of cross-referencing that needs to happen, and it's quite interesting. When I said ethnic district, anyway, let's not go into this anymore. We've got a few more minutes. The question I wanted to put to all of you is, once you put this stuff out there, how do you hope that your databases are going to be used, not just by other academics, but the general public as well? Anyone want to?
Yes. Well, when I created my database, I was thinking mainly on an academic audience, but I turned out to discover that there are a lot of people who are doing genealogy work, and they use frequently now with discussions about reparations. They also access the site. So activists now they often access the site too, and teachers, right? School teachers. They also access the site and use it in their lessons, right?
Right.
I'll jump in if we'll do reverse order maybe. So genealogists are mostly who I've got who seem to be using the resource as well. I only ever hear from them if someone's missing, because this doesn't, my database doesn't quite cover the whole time period that the prison is open. So nearly the only time I hear is like, my ancestor isn't here, he was on Cockatoo Island, and then I have to, say that I'm hoping to extend it, but we'll see, manpower and all that. But I suppose I would like people to engage with kind of the full data set, but I suppose that's what the lives are about, is trying to pick out stories that they might not necessarily see, that might not be their ancestor. I haven't heard from any ancestor on any convicts' lives that I've dug into. I'd like more people just to see it. I think it is just a WordPress site that I put together, so it's not the most findable. So anyone that wants to use it, I'd be happy for them to do so. But it was aimed at family historians and genealogists, and they seem to be using it, so that's positive for me.
Great. And Charles, what are your hopes for your database? Is he still here?
I think he dropped the call.
Oh no, that's a shame.
Yeah.
Well, I think we can all think of things we'd like to do with it. But I think that's really important for us as well with what's happening. We're always trying to make connections between academia and other users, and I think certainly in connection, like Yvonne is just saying in the chat, school teachers would be interested in such databases. I think they really could lend themselves to school use, and having something for young people to dig into and find things that they can't find in books. And and I think also when it's local history, or imagine finding someone in the Convicts database that has the same surname or something like that. I think and especially in the English national curriculum, there's a requirement for a local study. So it's another place where we could get students looking at Black history without having to change the curriculum while we're waiting for that to happen. So I think it could be a really great way for people to do sort of small scale case studies, and we've seen the great impact that can have from Newham this morning. So do you, Katie or Daniel, I'm sad if Charles has left us permanently, but do either of you have anything else you wanted to say, or should we go to the
Charles is back, so I don't know if he wants
back. Charles, hello.
Yeah, I just came back. I'm sorry, my wireless dropped.
No problem. Great. Well, welcome back. So I just wanted to ask how you're hoping your database will be used once it's out there.
Well, I see it having two audiences. One is the academic, clearly, but also I've always had in my mind, so maybe similar to what Katie just said, the 8th grader in South Side of Chicago, who's, who most American schools don't do a very good job. This is a way where they can literally, especially with mariners, this whole idea of being at sea, it's such a different world and sort of off, especially for people in American Midwest, this idea that something's happening, it's so unusual, so different, and it's happening to someone who looks like me. So one of the things where I used to teach, Eastern Illinois has a social studies curriculum for teachers. And so I've been working with the person there to sort of come up with games and exercises that kids in middle school, particularly I sort of engage in gender stereotypes. 6th to 8th grade boys are sort of a perfect audience for Black mariners because literally they can see themselves in these lives. There's some cross-dressing women that you could use for young girls, but most of it probably would have a gender dimension to it. And I think that for those kids, it could be a really wonderfully engaging way of connecting to history in a way it just seems, because in America, we don't teach colonial history in most of our K through 12s. The kids come to the university, they know almost nothing about history prior to the American Revolution. So it'd be a great way that kids could personalize and understand that component. And so maybe actually lead them to other paths outside of Black history and outside of American history, out into world history. So, for example, the guy who starts my article in Gretchen's anthology, this guy Amos Anderson, literally leaves Rhode Island. His father's transported from Nigeria to Rhode Island. He goes from Rhode Island, is captured. He's sold into slavery in the West Indies, then lands up in England, where he then accuses his Black shipmate of stealing his money. There's a whole sort of story there where it literally becomes fun over time. So I kind of think that would be an audience to the double dimension.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and that's kind of what we were talking about while you were briefly not with us as well. And I sort of was googling and tweeting when Katie mentioned this the first bushranger in Australia being Black, and it turns out his nickname was Black Caesar. And before he ended up in Australia, he'd been a servant in Deptford in England in the 1580s. So, again, if you were in a school in Deptford, like it's going to, I think it just blow your mind to think that there was this guy who was living down the road from you who ended up, in being Australia's first.
Exactly.
I think these fantastic global connections. Charles, just curiously, right. Have you connected your data at all with portraits of Black sailors, such as the ones in the background of those deaths of Nelson and imagery at all?
Well, I've got a whole sort of file and folder of all these images. So there's, for example, the one you saw with the plantation receipt has never been publicly shown. As I said, I really found it in the back of plantation receipts. So there's, one of the things that would be nice, it gets into this issue that Daniel talked about earlier with the letters, which is the issue of copyright. Those kinds of images are wonderful because I think for most people, put aside academics, it would give them a whole different way of thinking about the past. This idea that this man who's clearly African, wearing an African headdress, who literally was clearly imported fairly recently, is the person who rows the rice down to Charleston, which becomes the foundation of South Carolina's economic engine. That would be a great piece of information to use in an 8th grade classroom, right? It would be a way of bringing South Carolinian state history to life. Yeah, so I think those kinds of things are important. I'm trying to work, there's a new museum of African history in Charleston that's just coming out, just under development right now. And I've had some conversations with them about that because literally the combination of the database and the images would really, I think, change how people think about their local history.
Mm. Yeah, and I think it. I've been through the National Maritime Museum a few times, seeing how many Black faces I could spot in the background that have not been labelled. There was a Turner exhibition once as well, and I just went through it. But I think it's great to be able to combine those sources together and, sort of, and like you said, an image can speak of, anyway, that's another project that I will contact you about at some point. But
Okay.
Are there any other questions that anyone wants to raise? Or I think, should we, there's a lot of really useful stuff happening in the chat, and I think that we should be able, we're recording it, so the chat should be able to be downloaded afterwards as well and made available by Olga, I think, if you're here, to anyone who's interested.